I decided to try a little different format this time because I wanted to do some night sky photography, and there's not a lot of B-roll and video that you can shoot when it's that dark out. So I have some of the lead up to that, which I'll get to here in a minute. But any of us who live on the east coast of the United States know how difficult it is to actually find dark skies to do any kind of night sky photography. There's just so much light pollution, it's unbelievable. So we have to find places to go. We have to travel to get there. But there are a couple spots on the East Coast that are listed as night sky preserves, and one of the closest ones to the New York, Baltimore area is Cherry Springs State Park, which is in north central Pennsylvania. And you can see by the map that I'm going to show you that most of the I-95 corridor and pretty much anywhere along the east coast of the United States through halfway across the United States is just completely filled with light pollution. But there are a couple of those spots that have been set aside that have reasonably dark skies, and in some cases almost completely dark skies. And one of those is Cherry Springs State Park. It's only about a 5-hour drive from Baltimore or New York or Philadelphia. So if you're anywhere in that range, or even say 5 hours to the west of that, it's certainly worth the drive in seeing something that most folks along the East Coast have never really had an opportunity to see from their own homes. I got here about 15 minutes before official sunset, which is fine. It's actually better to get here now so my eyes can adjust with the sun as it sets. I'll still have enough light to get set up. So one of the things to consider when you're doing night sky photography is the fact that the stars are moving, obviously. Well, the Earth is moving, and it makes it look like the stars are moving. And because it is as dark as it is, you have to leave your shutter open for a much longer period of time. So you have to consider how you want to go about that. Now, a lot of people use a star tracker, which sets up on your tripod and allows your camera to follow the stars, and so the stars would not streak through your lens, but the Earth and anything in the background or foreground would definitely move. Your other option is that you just set it on a tripod and you try to work with the longest exposure you possibly can that will give you the stars in your shot without having them trail too much. And a lot of people use the rule of 600. There's a couple other terms they like to use for it, but the basic idea is you take the number 600 and you divide it by the focal length of your lens, and that'll determine pretty much about how many seconds of exposure time you will have before you start to see streaks rather than just dots or pinpoints. So if you were using a 100 millimeter focal length, you would only have about 6 seconds of exposure time before you would start to get trails. I have myself all set up. Got the Canon T6 up here with a broken on 8mm fixed focus fisheye, which I have set all the way open at 3.5, and I'll be using bulb setting on that one. And down below I have the Olympus set up. Yeah, it's kind of engineered with that octopod going on there, the Gorilla tripod, just to try and get it set. I couldn't get it set up on this and have it stay. I might try a different configuration on it, but we'll see what I can get with it. I don't have a wide angle for the Olympus, so I'll do my best with it as wide as it will go. It gets a fairly good frame on it, so we should be in pretty good shape. We'll see what happens. Nice, clear, cloudless skies tonight, and the only thing that is of any concern whatsoever is that. Might be a little hard to see in there, but the smoke from campfires is hanging fairly low, and I hope it doesn't mess up the shots. But we'll see what happens. Once it gets dark enough, I really won't be able to record much B-roll or directly with the GoPro, so this might be good evening to you. If there's any light later, I'll see what I can do. Bye. I made a few adjustments. I went ahead and moved my Olympus up higher, right underneath the Canon, and seems like there's a lot of light, but there's not a lot of light left. It's getting dark, which is good. Always good to be out here when it's still light and let the sky get dark around you, because it's so much easier to see than it is trying to walk out into the dark from bright light. Jupiter's already out, Venus is out, and at this point I'm just going to sit back, relax, put my jacket on, and let the sky get dark around me. Now, I was using an 8mm fixed focus fisheye lens, which means if I divide 600 by that, I'm going to have somewhere in the range of 70 seconds or so before I really start to notice the star trail or the blur going on from the motion, which is a pretty good amount of time. What I discovered once I started working was that I really didn't need more than 30 seconds to actually get a fairly good exposure when using that lens in particular, and I had it wide open at 3.5, which let a lot of light in. I have no idea how this is going to look on this camera, but you can see Venus, and from where I'm standing, that sunset's just a gorgeous orange glow. Another thing to consider with night sky photography, of course, is your focus, because let's face it, it's pretty difficult to try and focus on little tiny points of light by looking through your camera. You can do that a couple of different ways. You can either use your camera in live view and then zoom in and take a look and get your focus down, because the autofocus isn't going to work no matter what you try. But get it set by looking at the blown up view, and then you can back out again, and you should have a fairly accurate focus. Or you can get a fixed focus lens like the one I was using, which meant there was no focusing for me to do in the first place. Or you can set yourself up well enough ahead of time before the sun goes all the way down and find a very, very distant spot to focus on. And once you get that focus down, don't move it. Leave it in manual. Turn off your autofocus, because if your autofocus is on, it's just going to sit there and move back and forth with nothing to focus on, and you'll have totally messed up everything that you set earlier. Either way, you're trying to get the smallest, most crisp pinpoint of light you can get. If you're not sure about it, take a few photos, see what they look like, adjust a little bit here and there to try and find the best focus you possibly can. Now, a little bit more on shutter speed. Our eyes can see a great deal in the dark, and the camera can see much more than we can if you leave the shutter open long enough. Now, it all comes down to timing and really trying to find exactly what you're looking for. And I'm going to show you a couple of different photos of different shutter speeds, and you can definitely see a difference in the amount of light the camera's picking up, and you're just going to have to work with it. You're going to have to make adjustments, take a photo, see what it looks like. If it doesn't seem like it's enough, you're going to bump it up a little bit more and a little bit more until you find what amounts to a happy medium in what you are going to accept as enough exposure without being overexposed or overly grainy. You're just going to have to find what you're happiest with at that point. Now, obviously, since we are talking about trying to let enough light into the camera, we have to talk about your ISO. Normally, out in nice bright daylight like this, you're going to be shooting in the 100, 200, maybe 400, depending on what it is you're doing, how much shade you're dealing with. When you're trying to do night sky photography, you're necessarily going to have to bump your ISO up into the 3200 and above range. Now, the one problem that comes with that is the fact that bumping up your ISO means your photos are going to get grainier and grainier the higher you go. It really comes down to, again, what you find acceptable. Now, I was shooting mostly in ISO 3200, which wasn't too bad, I have to admit. They looked pretty good. There wasn't too much grain going on, but there are some ways that we can correct for some of that, and I'm going to talk about that next. Now, in talking about trying to get good night sky photos, we're going to have to talk about editing and editing software. No matter how good the shot looks coming out of the back of your camera, it is definitely to your benefit to use some form of editing software, whether that's just Photoshop or some form of stacking software. You're going to get the best quality image you can by stacking your photos. And by stacking, I mean you're going to need to take a sequence of photos with very similar exposure levels and with the exact same angle. So your camera, of course, has to be on a tripod anyway. But you're going to want to take a 30-second exposure and then another 30-second exposure in a string of, say, 5 to 10. And you're going to take those photos and you're going to put them on either Photoshop or one of a number of different star stacking programs, and it's going to go ahead and stack them up so all of the stars align with one another, and you get a much better exposure out of it. Then you can make adjustments to your contrast, to your exposure, your highlights, your shadows, play with the white balance a little bit, because no matter how hard you try, it's always going to be maybe a little bit red or maybe a little bit green, and you're going to want to fix those things in post-processing. Overall, it was a really great night. The skies were perfectly clear. There were very few people around, and now sadly I was not able to light up any of the foreground. When you're shooting night sky photos, it really is beneficial to light up your foreground a little bit, give some form of foreground interest. There's nothing wrong with a beautiful view of the sky, but if you really want to set up a scenario where the viewer has an idea of the size and scope of what you're dealing with, it helps to have foreground. Normally you would get out a flashlight or some other form of lighting and you would just very gently light it up. Unfortunately, there were a lot of other people out there with telescopes and cameras, and there was no light allowed in that way. But even so, it made for good practice, and it made for some really, really good photos. I sat from 8:30 in the evening until it was dark enough to actually get clear photos, which was somewhere between 10:30 and 11, and I continued shooting until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I just can't say enough as to how beautiful it was being there, how peaceful and quiet, and how very, very small, in a good way, it felt being there underneath the stars and the Milky Way like that. If you ever get an opportunity to head to some place where it's actually dark at night and clear, I recommend you do it as soon as possible. Even if you don't take your camera, just go and sit out underneath the stars and enjoy it. My hope is to get back up there as soon as possible and get more photos, and to maybe head to some other locations where I can also find dark skies with a little more visual interest in my foreground. This coming October I'm heading to Iceland, and my hope is that I can get some night sky shots while I'm in Iceland with some of the beautiful scenery that there is to find in Iceland. So for now, I'm going to say have a good day and get out. Take some night sky shots as well.